400 years. 400 bloody years. That's how long the Galactic Council's first contact protocol took to complete. And what did Earth do when they finally received the official invitation to join the cosmic community? They ignored it completely, like it was a telemarketer calling during dinner. But let's back up a bit, shall we? Because this story starts with the most bureaucratically obsessed species in the known universe, the quillfins. These purple, tentacled creatures had turned paperwork into an art form, so refined that they required 17 different forms just to request a form to request another form. Their leader, Borthwick Tentaclethwaite, the 43rd, had spent his entire 300-year career perfecting what he considered the crown jewel of galactic diplomacy, the comprehensive interspecies cultural assessment and integration protocol for previously uncontacted civilizations. The CI Puck, as absolutely nobody called it because saying it out loud made most species sound like they were choking on a hairball, was Borthwick's masterpiece. It involved exactly 47,293 steps, each one more mind-numbingly specific than the last. Step 23,847, for instance, required a detailed analysis of the target species' bathroom habits, including but not limited to preferred toilet paper thickness and whether they squeezed the toothpaste tube from the middle or the end. Step 12,094 demanded a comprehensive study of recreational activities, which in Earth's case led to a 4,000-page dissertation on why humans voluntarily subjected themselves to something called reality television. Step 33,781 required documentation of mating rituals, which resulted in Borthwick's team spending 6 months trying to understand the cultural significance of something called dating apps, and why humans seem to judge potential partners based on their ability to pose with sedated tigers. Step 41,203 involved analyzing the species' approach to conflict resolution, which led to several years of bewildered observation as humans simultaneously invented international peace organizations and increasingly creative methods of destroying each other. Step 8,765 required documentation of artistic expression, resulting in a 12-volume analysis of why humans considered both the Mona Lisa and pictures of food on social media to be equally valid forms of creative achievement. When the quillfins first discovered Earth in the year 2157, Borthwick was ecstatic. Finally, a chance to implement his protocol in its full, glorious, soul-crushing detail. He assembled a team of the galaxy's most patient observers, creatures so dedicated to tedium that they made tax auditors look like thrill-seekers and insurance adjusters seem like daredevils. The observation team included Flixworth Mumblebee, a 6-legged insectoid whose species communicated entirely through interpretive dance, which made his detailed reports absolutely fascinating to watch, but completely useless for actual information gathering. Flixworth had a particular talent for translating human emotional states into elaborate choreographic sequences, though his interpretation of mild annoyance looked remarkably similar to someone having a seizure while operating a jackhammer during an earthquake. There was also Grunthilde Splotchnob, a gelatinous blob who took comprehensive notes by absorbing and analyzing microscopic particles from Earth's atmosphere. She had the unfortunate habit of tasting everything, which led to some rather interesting commentary about human pollution levels. According to Grunthilde's taste reports, the year 2300 had been particularly delicious, with notes of industrial waste and a subtle bouquet of automotive exhaust that really complemented the underlying despair of urban commuting. The team's meteorologist was Quibbleton Rainsworth, a crystalline being whose species experienced weather as a form of music. His reports on Earth's climate patterns read like avant-garde poetry, describing hurricanes as violent symphonies of atmospheric rage and gentle spring showers, as the planet weeping tears of joy while contemplating its own mortality. This made his weather predictions utterly incomprehensible but strangely moving, often bringing council members to tears during quarterly review meetings. Rounding out the team was Noodlebop Squishface, whose job title was officially cultural anthropologist, but who spent most of his time trying to understand why humans found it amusing to watch videos of small animals falling asleep in unexpected places. His 847-volume analysis of cat videos as a reflection of human psychological needs and existential anxiety became required reading at the Galactic Academy for Xenological Studies and spawned 3 different academic disciplines. The team also included Blorbington Wibblewonk, a floating brain in a jar who specialized in analyzing human communication patterns and had developed a particular fascination with the human tendency to say literally when they meant figuratively. His reports on this phenomenon alone filled 200 filing cabinets and included a philosophical treatise on whether humans were evolving a new form of ironic communication or simply losing their collective minds. For 4 centuries, this dedicated team watched Earth with the intensity of a cat stalking a laser pointer operated by someone having a nervous breakdown. They documented everything: how humans picked their noses when they thought nobody was watching, the inexplicable popularity of reality television shows about people watching other reality television shows, and the bewildering human tendency to argue about whether hot dogs were sandwiches while simultaneously accepting that cereal was soup. They catalogued human fashion trends, which led to a particularly perplexing 200-year period where Noodlebop tried to understand why humans would pay enormous sums for clothing that had been deliberately torn and distressed, then pay even more to have it look older and more worn. His report concluded that humans must be a masochistic species that equated suffering with social status, a theory that seemed to be confirmed by their invention of high-heeled shoes, skinny jeans, and performance art. The team meticulously documented human recreational activities, leading to Blorbington's famous 47-volume study, Why Humans Voluntarily Subject Themselves to Extreme Physical Discomfort for Fun, an analysis of marathon running, hot yoga, and competitive eating. Indeed, the study included detailed observations of humans paying money to have other humans yell at them in gymnasiums, voluntarily consuming foods that caused visible physical distress, and gathering in large groups to watch other humans chase a ball around various geometric configurations. Borthwick's reports grew increasingly thick and increasingly incomprehensible. By year 200 of observation, he had filled 847 filing cabinets with data about human mating rituals alone, including a particularly dense subsection on the mysterious human custom of ghosting, which seemed to involve disappearing from romantic relationships with the efficiency of actual supernatural entities, but none of the courtesy. The cabinet of social hierarchies took up an entire warehouse, and included detailed analyses of human status symbols, from expensive coffee beverages to shoes that cost more than most species' annual incomes. The researchers were particularly baffled by the human tendency to display wealth through objects that served no practical purpose, leading to a 300-page report titled Luxury Handbags, Functional Storage, or Elaborate Mating Display. The documentation of human transportation methods occupied 3 city blocks and included a particularly dense section on why humans had invented vehicles capable of traveling at speeds that would liquefy their internal organs, only to use them primarily for sitting in traffic jams while slowly losing their sanity to the sound of talk radio hosts discussing conspiracy theories about alien observation teams. The analysis of human culinary practices required its own climate-controlled facility, partly because some of the research samples had achieved sentience and were demanding workers' rights, and partly because the section on things humans will eat on a dare alone took up 47 volumes and included a disclaimer warning readers that some content might cause existential despair in species with functioning taste buds or basic survival instincts. The Department of Human Recreational Activities had grown so large it had its own zip code, postal service and a small gift shop that sold souvenirs to visiting bureaucrats from other departments. The gift shop's best-selling item was a coffee mug that read, "I spent 400 years watching humans and all I got was this lousy mug and profound questions about the nature of intelligence." The other council members began to get slightly impatient. Slightly, because when you're dealing with species that live for thousands of years and consider a century to be a reasonable lunch break, patience is measured in geological terms. But even the ancient crystalline elders, who typically made decisions with the urgency of continental drift and the enthusiasm of sedimentary rock formation, started tapping their rocky appendages meaningfully during council meetings. "Borthwick!" wheezed Elder Granitefax, whose voice sounded like two mountain ranges having a philosophical discussion about the meaning of erosion. "Perhaps we could speed things up a teensy bit." "Speed things up!" Borthwick's tentacles turned a shocking shade of magenta, which in Quilfin culture was equivalent to suggesting someone's mother was a hamster and their father smelt of elderberries. "Do you have any idea how complex human social structures are? They have something called influencers who make millions of credits by filming themselves eating cereal while discussing their feelings about breakfast. We need at least another century to properly analyze this phenomenon." He gestured wildly at a stack of reports that had grown so tall it required its own elevator system, structural engineering support, and a small team of mountain climbers to reach the top. Just yesterday, Noodlebop discovered that humans have developed a form of communication that consists entirely of small pictographic representations of their emotional states. They call them emojis, and they've somehow managed to conduct entire conversations using nothing but tiny yellow circles with various facial expressions. Elder Crystallotus, whose patience was legendary even among species known for their geological approach to time management, and whose last recorded moment of excitement had occurred during the Permian extinction event, made a sound like gravel being slowly stirred in a cement mixer by someone who had given up on life. "Perhaps, dear Borthwick, we could consider that not every aspect of human culture requires documentation. Maybe we could skip some of the less essential details." "Less essential?" Borthwick's color shifted to a shade of purple that hadn't been seen since the great bureaucratic crisis of 1847, when a filing error had resulted in an entire star system being accidentally classified as office supplies. "Are you suggesting that my analysis of human recreational nose-picking patterns is somehow unimportant? That the comprehensive study of their tendency to argue about the proper way to load a dishwasher is merely optional?" The truth was that Borthwick had become so obsessed with his protocol that he had forgotten its original purpose. What had started as a method for establishing diplomatic contact had evolved into an academic exercise in excessive documentation. His team had documented everything from human sneezing patterns to the cultural significance of arguing about pizza toppings, but they still hadn't actually figured out how to say hello without requiring the completion of 847 preliminary forms. Meanwhile, on Earth, humanity was blissfully unaware that they were the subject of the universe's most thorough and pointless surveillance operation. They went about their daily lives, inventing new ways to argue on the internet, creating increasingly ridiculous fashion trends, and somehow managing to function as a civilization despite having the collective attention span of a caffeinated goldfish with anxiety disorders. Dr. Prudence Wigglesworth, Earth's leading xenobiologist and holder of 17 different degrees in fields that most people couldn't pronounce correctly, had been searching for signs of extraterrestrial life for 30 years. She had pointed radio telescopes at every corner of the sky, analyzed atmospheric compositions of distant planets, and even tried communicating through interpretive agricultural formations, which mostly just confused local farmers and attracted conspiracy theorists who were convinced she was either a government agent, an alien herself, or possibly both. Her office at the International Institute for Xenobiological Research was a monument to organized chaos and the triumph of caffeine over common sense. The walls were covered with star charts, atmospheric analysis reports, and a collection of coffee-stained napkins on which she'd scribbled late-night theories about the statistical probability of intelligent life existing elsewhere in the universe. Her desk was buried under towers of research papers, most of which concluded that the universe was probably teeming with life, but that life was apparently too busy or too polite to return her calls. What she hadn't expected was that the aliens were right there, hovering just outside her planet's atmosphere, taking notes about human bathroom habits and filing reports about the philosophical implications of breakfast cereals and the deep existential questions raised by humans' relationship with carbohydrates. The observation ship was so technologically advanced that it existed in a state of quantum invisibility, which meant it was simultaneously there and not there, visible and invisible, depending on whether anyone was actively looking for it and whether they had filled out the proper forms for observing quantum phenomena. This was extremely convenient for secret observation, but terrible for the aliens' insurance premiums, and had led to several awkward conversations with cosmic traffic control. The irony was thick enough to cut with a butter knife and serve at a formal dinner party for people who enjoyed discussing the weather patterns of distant gas giants while simultaneously complaining about the local weather. Dr. Wigglesworth's research assistant, a brilliant but scattered young woman named Penelope Crankshaw, who had the attention span of a hummingbird on espresso, had actually detected the alien ship 17 times over the past decade. However, each time she tried to show her findings to Dr. Wigglesworth, something would happen. The coffee machine would explode, a fire drill would be called, or her computer would mysteriously crash and display nothing but pictures of dancing penguins wearing formal attire. This was actually the ship's automated defense system, designed to prevent accidental discovery by deflecting attention through minor but memorable inconveniences. The system had been programmed by Blorbington Wibblewonk, who had spent considerable time studying human psychology and had concluded that humans could be distracted from almost anything by sufficiently amusing malfunctions or unexpected animal videos. As the 400th year of observation approached, Borthwick finally declared his protocol complete. The final report was a masterwork of bureaucratic excess that made tax codes look like haikus. 15,847 volumes, each one bound in the finest recycled cosmic dust and organized according to a classification system so complex that it required its own instruction manual, which in turn required its own instruction manual, which required a third instruction manual just to explain how to find the first instruction manual. The volumes were arranged in order of bureaucratic importance, which meant that Volume 1 contained 200 pages of copyright notices, disclaimers, and acknowledgements thanking everyone who had ever contributed to the project, including the janitor who had emptied Borthwick's wastebasket, the cafeteria worker who had served him lunch for the past 4 centuries, and the maintenance technician who had fixed his desk lamp that one time in 2387. Volume 2 was entirely devoted to the table of contents for Volumes 3 through 847, while Volume 3 contained an index explaining how to use the table of contents, which referenced Volume 4's guide to understanding the index. Volume 5 was a glossary of terms used in the previous volumes. Volume 6 was a glossary of terms used in the glossary, and Volume 7 was a philosophical treatise on the nature of definitions and whether it was possible to truly define anything without first defining the concept of definition itself. The actual observations of human behavior didn't begin until Volume 847, which started with a 400-page introduction explaining why it was important to read Volumes 1 through 846 before attempting to understand the contents of Volume 847, followed by a 200-page summary of the previous 846 volumes, and then a 100-page explanation of why the summary was necessary and how to interpret its findings. "Gentle beings," Borthwick announced during the Grand Council session, his voice quivering with the pride of someone who had just organized the universe's most comprehensive collection of useless information and was quite pleased with himself about it. "After 4 centuries of meticulous observation, I am pleased to present the complete cultural analysis of species designation, Earth Human Sol 3, bipedal carbon-based, mostly harmless except when driving." He gestured dramatically at the towering collection of volumes, which had been arranged in the council chamber's main auditorium, and required a small army of interns, 3 freight elevators, and a professional logistics team to keep properly organized. The display was so impressive that several council members applauded, though whether they were applauding the achievement, the fact that it was finally finished, or simply the fact that they were still awake was unclear. The council chamber fell silent. This was partly due to reverence for such a monumental achievement, and partly because most of the council members had fallen asleep somewhere around hour 17 of Borthwick's presentation. Elder Crystallotus had actually achieved a state of geological hibernation, which meant he wouldn't wake up for another 3 centuries unless someone physically shook him. And given that he weighed approximately 47 tons and was technically considered a protected geological formation, this was unlikely to happen. Elder Granitefax cleared his throat with the sound of an avalanche, having second thoughts about its life choices. "Excellent work, Borthwick. Now perhaps we can finally make contact." "Indeed!" Borthwick's excitement was palpable, and his tentacles had turned a shade of gold that was normally reserved for religious holidays, tax refunds, and the annual office party. "According to Protocol subsection 4729, paragraph 23, line 847, we must now transmit the official galactic welcome message, followed by the standard first contact questionnaire, the cultural exchange proposal form, and the membership application for the Galactic Council, which comes in 3 parts and requires notarization by at least 7 different species, 2 of whom must be telepathic. The message preparation took another 6 months, because everything had to be translated not just into human languages, but into the proper bureaucratic format required by Galactic Council regulations, which had been written by a committee of the galaxy's most pedantic beings, and had never been successfully understood by anyone, including the beings who had written them. The translation team included specialists in 47,293 different languages, including several that had been dead for millennia, but were still required by law to be included in all official communications, 3 languages that existed only in theoretical mathematics, and 1 language that could only be spoken by beings who had achieved a state of transcendent boredom. The xylophonic translators, a species that communicated through musical tones and had never learned to speak quietly, spent 3 weeks converting the message into a symphony that lasted 847 hours and required an orchestra of 12,000 musicians, all of whom had to be trained in the proper pronunciation of bureaucratic terminology set to music in keys that didn't exist in most dimensional frameworks. The geometric interpreters created a version that could only be understood by looking at increasingly complex mathematical equations while standing on one's head, spinning clockwise, and contemplating the nature of infinity. The telepathic lobsters produced a version that could only be transmitted through direct mind-to-mind contact, which was problematic because humans weren't telepathic and lobsters made most species uncomfortable regardless of their psychic abilities. The message was transmitted with all the ceremony befitting such a momentous occasion and the kind of pomp that usually accompanied the launching of new bureaucratic initiatives. It was broadcast on every conceivable frequency, translated into 47,293 languages, including several that humans hadn't invented yet and probably never would, and accompanied by a holographic presentation that explained the rich history of galactic civilization. complete with pie charts, interpretive dance sequences, and a rather catchy theme song performed by the Galactic Council's official choir. The choir consisted of a group of crystalline beings whose voices could shatter glass at 47 different frequencies, several gas-based entities who sang by manipulating their molecular structure, and one enthusiastic blob who provided percussion by rhythmically jiggling. The theme song, titled "Welcome to the Galaxy, Please Fill Out Forms in Triplicate," had become surprisingly popular at diplomatic functions throughout the known universe. The transmission array required the combined power output of 3 stars, and was so complex that it needed its own artificial intelligence just to operate the control systems. The AI, named Computron 5000 Deluxe Plus Pro Max Ultra Supreme with extra features, had developed a mild case of existential depression after calculating the statistical probability that the entire message would be ignored, but it performed its duties with the resigned efficiency of a cosmic customer service representative who had long ago given up hope of ever receiving a positive performance review. The aliens waited for a response, and waited some more. 3 days passed. Then a week, then a month. Nothing, not even a polite thanks but no thanks, not a confused "who is this?", not even an angry "stop calling this number," or "please remove us from your mailing list." Complete and utter silence. Borthwick began to panic. His tentacles turned a worried shade of beige, which in Quilfin culture indicated either mild concern, severe digestive distress, or the early stages of a bureaucratic breakdown. Perhaps they didn't receive it. Maybe their communication technology is more primitive than we thought. Flixworth performed an elaborate dance that roughly translated to, "Maybe they're just really busy," though it could also have meant, "I think I left my keys in my other dimension. Has anyone seen my lunch?" Or, "Why do we keep expecting different results from the same ridiculous process?" Insectoid interpretive dance was notoriously difficult to translate with precision, partly because most of their movements looked like seizures to other species, and partly because Flixworth had a tendency to incorporate his personal anxieties into his professional communications. Grunthilda, who had been tasting the electromagnetic residue from the transmission with the dedication of a sommelier analyzing a particularly complex vintage, reported that it had definitely reached Earth and had been absorbed by something called the Internet, which she described as tasting like a mixture of cat videos, political arguments, and pizza grease with undertones of desperation, overconfidence, and what I can only describe as the flavor of people arguing about things they don't understand. The council decided to wait a bit longer. Surely the humans were just taking their time to formulate an appropriate response. After all, first contact was a big deal, possibly the biggest deal in the history of any species. Perhaps they were consulting their leaders, preparing a formal reply, organizing a welcome committee, or possibly just trying to figure out which department was supposed to handle communications from space. 6 months passed. Still nothing. The aliens began to get slightly concerned. Had they offended the humans somehow? Was there something wrong with the translation? Had they accidentally declared war instead of extending friendship? Had the message been filtered into some sort of cosmic spam folder by Earth's primitive but apparently effective electronic mail systems? Quibbleton Rainsworth suggested that perhaps Earth's atmospheric conditions were interfering with the transmission, though his explanation involved a 30-minute interpretive weather dance that left everyone more confused than enlightened and slightly concerned about his mental health. His performance included what appeared to be an impression of a thunderstorm having an identity crisis, followed by his interpretation of a rainbow questioning its life choices. Noodlebop Squishface theorized that humans might be so overwhelmed by the cultural significance of first contact that they were taking time to process the implications through their apparent obsession with creating memes about everything. His theory was supported by his observation that humans seem to deal with major events by turning them into jokes, which he found both admirable and deeply concerning. Meanwhile, somewhere in the middle of nowhere, specifically in the spam folder of an email account belonging to Dr. Prudence Wigglesworth, the most important message in human history, sat unread between offers for cosmic enhancement pills, invitations to invest in a time travel scheme that seemed legitimate but probably wasn't, and at least 17 messages claiming she had inherited millions of Quetlus from a distant galactic relative she'd never heard of, but who apparently thought very highly of her. Dr. Wigglesworth was having her morning coffee and checking her emails when she noticed something odd in her spam folder. The subject line read, "Official Galactic Council First Contact Communication. Please respond within standard galactic business cycles. Urgent final notice. Please don't ignore us. We've been waiting for centuries." She almost deleted it immediately. The sender was listed as Supreme Bureaucrat Borthwick Tentacled the 43rd, Department of Interspecies Relations, Galactic Council Headquarters, Sector 7G, Level 847, Office Complex Zeta Prime, Subbasement Delta, Filing Cabinet 12094, Drawer 3, Folder 847, Subfolder B, Document Classification Ultra Mega Important. Please don't ignore, seriously we mean it. The email address alone was longer than most doctoral dissertations she'd read, and she'd read quite a few, being the type of person who found academic papers relaxing bedtime reading. "Bloody scammers are getting creative," she muttered, hovering her cursor over the delete button, while simultaneously wondering who had the time and dedication to create such an elaborate fake address. But something made her pause. Maybe it was scientific curiosity. Maybe it was the fact that she'd had 3 cups of coffee and wasn't thinking clearly. Or maybe it was the small voice in the back of her head that whispered, "What if it's real?" The same voice that had convinced her to become a xenobiologist in the first place, despite the fact that the field had produced exactly 0 confirmed discoveries of extraterrestrial life and had a job security rating somewhere between professional lottery ticket buyer and freelance unicorn trainer. She opened the message. What she found was the most comprehensive, detailed, and utterly bewildering document she had ever encountered in a career that had involved reading government grant applications and academic committee reports. It began with a formal greeting in 47,293 languages, including several that made her computer speakers emit sounds like a whale trying to yodel while simultaneously having an existential crisis about the meaning of song. The greeting alone took 47 minutes to scroll through, and that was just the opening paragraph. The main body of the message was organized into 847 sections, each with its own subsections, appendices, footnotes that had footnotes of their own, and a complex cross-referencing system that seemed to require a degree in advanced mathematics and a minor in philosophy just to navigate successfully. Section 1 was titled Preliminary Greetings and Acknowledgements of Mutual Existence, which seemed like a reasonable place to start until she realized it was 200 pages long and mostly consisted of formal apologies for any inconvenience the message might cause, followed by a detailed explanation of why the apologies were necessary and how to interpret them in the context of galactic diplomatic protocol. The gist of it, as far as she could determine through the bureaucratic jungle, was that Earth had been invited to join something called the Galactic Council. The invitation came with approximately 15,000 pages of terms and conditions, a membership fee that would need to be paid in something called Quetlus, and a requirement to fill out forms that would make tax documents look like grocery lists written by someone who had given up on life. Dr. Wigglesworth read through the first 100 pages, then skipped to the end, then went back to the middle, then gave up and made herself another cup of coffee while contemplating whether this was the most elaborate prank in human history or evidence that the universe had a sense of humor about bureaucracy. "This is either the most elaborate scam in human history," she said to her cat, Professor Whiskers, or we've just been contacted by the most bureaucratic aliens in the universe. Professor Whiskers, who was far more intelligent than most government officials and had once successfully navigated the university's budget approval process by simply staring at people until they gave him what he wanted, simply stared at her with the kind of look that suggested she should probably do something about this situation before it got any more complicated. But what exactly do you do when you receive an official invitation to join a galactic civilization? There's no handbook for this sort of thing. No government department specifically designed for alien correspondence. No protocol for determining whether extraterrestrial bureaucrats are legitimate or just really committed pranksters with too much time on their hands and access to sophisticated translation software. Doctor, Wigglesworth did what any reasonable person would do in such circumstances. She forwarded the email to her colleague, Dr. Bartholomew Crumpet, with a note that said, "Bart, what do you make of this? P.S. If this is your idea of a joke, I'm putting sugar in your gas tank." Dr. Crumpet, who specialized in xenoarchaeology and had a reputation for being slightly more skeptical than a tax auditor at a charity auction run by people claiming to be time travelers, spent exactly 3 minutes reviewing the message before replying, "Prudence, I think you've been working too hard again. Also, my car runs on electricity, so your threat is meaningless. P.P.S. Have you considered the possibility that you're having a breakdown? Because this message reads like it was written by someone who took every bureaucratic manual in existence and fed them into a paper shredder operated by caffeinated ferrets." Undeterred, Dr. Wigglesworth forwarded the message to 17 more colleagues, 3 government agencies, the International UFO Research Foundation, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, the Department of Agriculture, because you never know. Her nephew, Timothy, who worked in IT and was supposedly good with computer stuff, and her mother, who she figured might have some practical advice about dealing with overly complicated correspondence. The responses ranged from very funny, Prue, to please remove me from your mailing list, to a lengthy analysis from the government agencies explaining why this was obviously a scam and why she should report it to the appropriate authorities, who would file it away in a secure location and never look at it again, unless someone specifically requested it through a Freedom of Information Act request, which would then be processed in 3 to 5 business years. Her nephew replied with a single word, "Eslawasl," followed by a dozen crying, laughing emojis and a link to a website that sold tinfoil hats at wholesale prices. Her mother sent back a recipe for chicken soup and a suggestion that she get more sleep. Meanwhile, in the depths of space, Borthwick was beginning to show signs of what humans might recognize as a nervous breakdown, if nervous breakdowns involved tentacles changing colors rapidly and making sounds like a vacuum cleaner trying to digest a symphony orchestra while simultaneously attempting to yodel. "They must have received it," he wailed, his appendages cycling through the entire visible spectrum and occasionally venturing into colors that didn't technically exist but hurt to look at anyway. "The transmission logs are clear. The message was delivered to 847 different communication networks on their planet." He gestured wildly at a wall-mounted display showing Earth's communication systems, which were blinking and beeping with the kind of electronic enthusiasm that suggested they were either working perfectly or about to explode in a spectacular fashion that would make excellent footage for human news programs. Elder Granitfax tried to remain diplomatic, though his patience was beginning to wear thin in the way that geological formations occasionally develop stress fractures after millennia of pressure. Perhaps their response time is simply different from ours. Some species take longer to process complex information. 400 years, Borthwick shrieked, his voice climbing to frequencies that were causing the ship's crystalline navigation systems to vibrate sympathetically and emit what sounded like the cosmic equivalent of a tuning fork having an anxiety attack. "We waited 400 years to send the message. How much more processing time could they possibly need?" This was when something unexpected happened. Something that would change the course of galactic history and prove that sometimes the universe has a sense of humor about the most serious situations. While the Galactic Council sat in their chambers debating response times and processing procedures, while Borthwick experienced what would later be classified as the first recorded case of bureaucratic spontaneous combustion, and while Dr. Wigglesworth tried to figure out what to do with the most important email in human history, a retired linguistics professor named Cornelius Bumblebottom was quietly revolutionizing interspecies communication. Cornelius, you see, had a hobby. He collected languages the way other people collected stamps or regrets, and he had spent the last 6 months teaching himself something called Galactic Standard, using translation software he'd downloaded from what he assumed was a very sophisticated file-sharing network, but was actually the Galactic Internet. He had not only learned to communicate in basic galactic, but had also figured out how to access the alien communication networks and had been quietly chatting with various extraterrestrial species for weeks, completely bypassing 4 centuries of bureaucratic protocol by the simple expedient of being friendly and asking if anyone wanted to talk. "The thing is," Cornelius would later explain to a stunned diplomatic committee, "most of them are lovely, bit formal but lovely, except for this one fellow named Borthwick, who seems to be having some sort of breakdown about proper procedures." And that, as they say in the Galactic Communication Handbooks, which were about to become much thinner, was how humanity's greatest diplomatic triumph began. Not with fanfare or formal protocols, but with a retired professor who couldn't sleep and thought it might be interesting to learn a new language. The universe, it turned out, had been waiting 400 years for someone to simply say hello without filling out the paperwork first. When news of Cornelius's unauthorized diplomatic activities reached the alien observation ship, it caused what could only be described as a bureaucratic nuclear meltdown. Borthwick experienced what medical professionals might recognize as the administrative equivalent of spontaneous combustion, his tentacles flickering between colors that existed only in theoretical physics textbooks and emitting sounds that registered on seismic equipment 3 star systems away. "Unauthorized contact!" he shrieked, his voice reaching frequencies that caused nearby coffee cups to crack and filing cabinets to rearrange themselves alphabetically. "This is completely against protocol. There are procedures, there are forms, there are proper channels, there are committees that need to approve the formation of committees to discuss the possibility of maybe considering eventual contact." Flicksworth performed what appeared to be either a calming dance or possibly a seizure, though given the stress of the situation, it could have been both simultaneously. His 6 legs moved in patterns that roughly translated to, "Maybe we should all take a deep breath and count to 10,000, though it might also have meant, "I think I'm having an existential crisis about the nature of bureaucracy." Gruntilda, who had been enjoying her conversations with Cornelius and had developed a taste for human humor, which she described as tasting like sarcasm with hints of desperation and coffee, tried to explain that the informal contact had actually been quite productive and refreshingly free of paperwork. "The human Cornelius is delightful," she bubbled, her gelatinous form quivering with enthusiasm. "He's taught me 17 new curse words and explained the concept of irony, which tastes absolutely fascinating, like bitter chocolate mixed with cosmic disappointment. Also, he's been very apologetic about his species' response time and has offered to help organize a proper reply to your original message." Proper reply? Borthwick had now turned a color that was simultaneously all colors and no colors, which was making everyone's eyes water and causing the ship's optical sensors to file formal complaints. After 400 years of preparation, 47,000 pages of documentation, and the most comprehensive first contact protocol in galactic history, they want to send a proper reply. "Well," Grunthilda said thoughtfully, "he did mention that most humans never actually read long emails, something about attention spans, and the general assumption that anything over 3 paragraphs is probably not worth their time unless it contains pictures of cats or promises of free pizza." Now, the silence that followed this revelation was so profound that it registered on seismic equipment 3 star systems away, and caused several nearby black holes to pause in their cosmic consumption to listen more carefully. Elder Granitfax cleared his throat carefully, producing a sound like continental drift reconsidering its life choices. "Borthwick, my dear fellow, perhaps it's time we considered the possibility that our approach might have been slightly overcomplicated." What happened next was later recorded in galactic history as the Great Bureaucratic Breakdown of 2557, or as Cornelius dubbed it in his memoirs, the day Borthwick lost his tentacles. Metaphorically speaking, though it was touch and go for a while, Borthwick began to laugh. It started as a small chuckle, then grew into a giggle, then exploded into full-blown hysterical laughter that sounded like a dozen tea kettles having nervous breakdowns in harmony while being operated by someone who had never seen a kettle before and wasn't entirely sure what they were supposed to do. 400 years! He gasped, between fits of laughter that were making the ship's hull vibrate at frequencies that threatened to shake loose every rivet, bolt, and quantum stabilizer. 47,000 pages, 15,000 forms, a protocol so complex it required its own instruction manual's instruction manual, and they didn't read it because it was too long. He laughed until his tentacles went limp, until his color stabilized into a resigned shade of beige that indicated either profound acceptance or the early stages of a mental breakdown, until he collapsed into his chair and stared at the ceiling with the expression of someone who had just realized that they had spent their entire career perfecting the art of making things unnecessarily complicated. "You know what?" he said finally, his voice quiet and strangely peaceful, like a mountain stream that had given up trying to erode rocks and decided to just enjoy the scenery instead. "Maybe the humans have the right idea." And with that, Borthwick Tentaclethwaite the 43rd did something that shocked the entire galactic community and caused several civilizations to immediately revise their emergency response protocols. He threw away the protocol, all of it. Every form, every procedure, every carefully crafted regulation that had taken centuries to develop and had grown so complex that it required its own zip code and postal service. He deleted the files, recycled the paper copies, and used the filing cabinets as planters for his collection of cosmic succulents, which had been neglecting for decades in favor of bureaucratic excellence. Then he did something even more revolutionary. He sent a message to Earth. It was 3 sentences long. "Hello, humans. We're your galactic neighbors. Would you like to be friends?" The response came back in 17 minutes. Typed by Dr. T. Wigglesworth, who had finally found Cornelius's contact information and was desperately trying to figure out what the appropriate diplomatic response should be to 4 centuries of bureaucratic overkill. "Sure, sounds fun. Can we bring snacks?" And that, as they say in the galactic communication handbooks, which had suddenly become much thinner and significantly more readable, was that. But of course, this being a story about humans and aliens and the fundamental absurdity of bureaucracy, things couldn't be quite that simple. Because while Borthwick was having his revolutionary moment of clarity, word of Earth's casual response to first contact was spreading throughout the galactic community like a cosmic wildfire powered by gossip and mild outrage. The Vroklings, a species of highly advanced beings, who communicated through interpretive geometry and had the patience of saints who had been trained in meditation by monks who specialized in waiting for geological events, sent a polite inquiry asking if perhaps they could help with the communication problem, since their own first contact protocol involved only 17 steps and had never required more than a century to complete. The Ziltoids, who were experts in xenopsychology and had successfully established relations with 15,000 different species without ever requiring anyone to fill out more than 3 forms, offered to review the Earth situation and provide recommendations for streamlining the process. The Blingworts, who were notorious for their ability to turn any situation into a profitable venture and had already cornered the market on interdimensional insurance policies, immediately began calculating the potential market value of Earth's entertainment industry and started preparing acquisition offers for something called reality television, which they were convinced was either a form of psychological warfare or the most sophisticated comedy ever devised. But most interestingly, the Grufflings, a species known for their refreshing directness and complete inability to understand bureaucracy. They had once caused a diplomatic incident by asking why anyone needed permission to be friendly, sent a simple message to the Galactic Council that would become famous throughout the known universe. Why don't you just ask them if they want to be friends? This suggestion caused several council members to faint, which is quite impressive when you consider that most of them didn't have traditional circulatory systems, and some existed primarily as organized energy patterns that couldn't technically lose consciousness. Back on Earth, Dr. Wigglesworth found herself at the center of what was rapidly becoming the most chaotic diplomatic situation in human history, which was saying something given humanity's track record with diplomacy. Her small committee of 3 had somehow grown to include approximately 847 people, most of whom had appointed themselves and none of whom could agree on anything except that someone else should probably be in charge. The meetings had become so chaotic that they needed meetings to plan the meetings, and committees to organize the committees that were planning the meetings about the committees. The bureaucracy had grown so complex that it was beginning to rival the aliens' original protocol, which would have been ironic if anyone had time to appreciate the irony. It was during one of these remarkably unproductive sessions, held in a conference room that now required security clearance to enter and had been declared a temporary embassy by 3 different government agencies, that something unexpected happened. Dr. Wigglesworth's phone rang. "Hello," said a voice that sounded like honey being poured over gravel by someone who had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of sounding both distinguished and approachable. "Is this the person in charge of talking to aliens?" Dr. Wigglesworth paused, looking around the room at the chaos of arguing bureaucrats, self-appointed experts, and at least one person who appeared to be live-streaming the entire proceedings to an audience that was either fascinated by diplomatic disasters or had seriously misunderstood what they were watching. I suppose. Who is this?" "My name is Cornelius Bumblebottom, and I think I might have solved your problem." Cornelius, it turned out, was a retired linguistics professor who lived in a small cottage outside Oxford and had spent his retirement collecting languages like other people collected stamps or regrets about career choices. He had spent the last 6 months teaching himself Galactic Standard using translation software he'd downloaded from what he assumed was a very sophisticated file-sharing network, but was actually the Galactic Internet, which explained why his computer had been running suspiciously well lately. He had not only learned to communicate in basic galactic, but had also figured out how to access the alien communication networks, and had been quietly chatting with various extraterrestrial species for weeks, completely bypassing centuries of diplomatic protocol by the simple expedient of being polite and genuinely curious about other cultures. "The thing is," Cornelius explained, while the committee sat in stunned silence that was somehow more productive than all their previous discussions combined, "most of them are lovely, bit formal, but lovely. There's this charming blob named Grunthilda, who's been very helpful with pronunciation and has a fascinating perspective on human cuisine, though she does have some concerning theories about what pizza tastes like to beings without traditional digestive systems. Dr. Wigglesworth felt like she was living in a dream, specifically the kind of dream where everything you've been struggling with turns out to have a simple solution that you somehow missed. You've been talking to aliens. Oh yes, quite regularly. There's a delightful crystalline being who shares the most fascinating geological poetry. Apparently, sedimentary rock formation is considered high art in his culture. The dancing insect fellow is a bit hard to follow, but his enthusiasm is infectious, though I'm not entirely sure whether he's trying to communicate or having some sort of medical episode. And what do they want from us? Cornelius smiled, and Dr. Wigglesworth realized that this was probably what sanity looked like. Calm, reasonable, and completely unburdened by the weight of bureaucratic expectations. Well, mostly they just want to know if we'd like to join their club. It's all very friendly, really, except for all the paperwork, which I gather has been something of a sore point. This was when Dr. Wigglesworth realized that humanity's response to first contact had been exactly what it should have been, completely, utterly, magnificently human. While the governments formed committees and the experts argued about protocols, a retired linguistics professor had simply decided to learn the language and make friends. While the bureaucrats worried about proper procedures, humanity had done what it always did, figured out a way around the system. "Cornelius," she said, "would you mind terribly if I asked you to help us sort this mess out?" "Delighted to," he replied cheerfully, though I should probably mention that I may have accidentally agreed to trade Earth's entire supply of cheese for something called temporal stabilization crystals. No, I'm not entirely sure what those are, but the Blingworts seemed very excited about the cheese, and I didn't want to be rude. Also, I think I may have inadvertently scheduled humanity to participate in something called the Galactic Talent Competition, though the details are a bit fuzzy since the invitation was transmitted entirely through interpretive dance. Meanwhile, news of Cornelius's unauthorized but remarkably successful diplomatic activities had spread throughout the galactic community faster than gossip at a cosmic PTA meeting. The reaction was mixed. Half the galaxy was impressed by humanity's refreshingly direct approach to interspecies communication. The other half was concerned that the humans might be so casual about galactic diplomacy that they would accidentally start a war by being too friendly, or possibly end one by offering to share their snacks. The Quillfins, who had spent 4 centuries perfecting their bureaucratic masterpiece, were experiencing something between admiration and existential crisis. Several of them had taken up meditation, while others had started small businesses selling efficiency through simplicity seminars to other bureaucratic species. Borthwick himself had undergone what could only be described as a complete personality renovation. His tentacles had settled into a peaceful shade of blue-green. He had started speaking in sentences shorter than doctoral dissertations, and he had been seen smiling, which was disturbing to his colleagues who weren't entirely sure that Quillfins were supposed to be capable of joy. The official joining ceremony was held 6 months later, which was a galactic record for diplomatic efficiency, and caused several civilizations to immediately revise their own first contact protocols. It took place partly on Earth and partly on the Galactic Council Station, connected by quantum communication links that allowed beings from across the galaxy to participate without anyone having to fill out travel forms. The entire event was refreshingly informal. Dr. Wigglesworth gave a short speech about humanity's excitement to join the galactic community, carefully avoiding any mention of the bureaucratic nightmare that had preceded this moment. Cornelius served as translator, though his running commentary, "Oh, that's Flicksworth, he's doing his happy dance," was arguably more informative than the actual diplomatic statements. The Blingwarts had indeed acquired Earth's entire cheese industry in exchange for temporal stabilization crystals, which turned out to be incredibly useful for keeping milk fresh and had the unexpected side effect of making Earth's dairy products the most sought-after luxury items in several star systems. The economic implications were staggering, and several financial analysts had declared it either the greatest trade deal in human history or evidence that humanity had no idea what they were doing, but were getting lucky anyway. The Vrocklings contributed a gift of geometric poetry that made several mathematicians weep with joy and caused at least one physicist to reconsider his understanding of dimensional mathematics. The Ziltoids offered free psychological counseling for anyone suffering from first contact adjustment syndrome, though they admitted they had never encountered a species that seemed so remarkably well adjusted to the concept of alien contact. Borthwick, who had undergone his bureaucratic metamorphosis and was now something of a celebrity in efficiency consulting circles, presented Earth with the shortest, most straightforward membership certificate in galactic history. It was 1 page long, written in plain language that could be understood by anyone with a basic education, and came with a helpful FAQ section that Cornelius had suggested and which covered important questions like, what are Quatloos? And is it normal for crystalline beings to sing about geological formations? But perhaps the most remarkable thing about the entire event was what happened when Elder Granitefax asked the traditional question that concluded all galactic membership ceremonies. What wisdom does your species offer to the galactic community? Dr. Wigglesworth thought for a moment, looking out at the assembled representatives from across the galaxy. Beings of incredible diversity and complexity who had somehow managed to create a functioning interstellar civilization despite their apparent love of bureaucracy. Then she smiled and said something that would be quoted in diplomatic textbooks for centuries to come. Sometimes, she said, the best response to a complicated question is to not respond at all. Sometimes silence says more than volumes of carefully crafted words, and sometimes the most efficient way to handle bureaucracy is to ignore it completely until someone comes up with a better system. She paused, looking directly at Borthwick, whose tentacles had turned a pleased shade of gold. But most importantly, she continued, sometimes the most profound diplomatic breakthrough happens when someone decides to skip the formal protocols and just say hello. The assembled representatives from across the galaxy considered this wisdom. After 400 years of watching humanity, they had learned something important. Sometimes the most sophisticated response to complexity is elegant simplicity. Borthwick nodded approvingly, his tentacles swaying in what might have been applause or possibly interpretive dance. It was hard to tell with Quillfins. His new philosophy was refreshingly straightforward. If it takes longer to explain than it does to do, you're probably doing it wrong. The ceremony concluded with what became known throughout the galaxy as the Great Interspecies Pizza Party, during which several species discovered that human food was surprisingly compatible with their biochemistry. Humans learned that Ziltoian music sounded exactly like jazz, but with more tentacles, and everyone agreed that bureaucracy was much more tolerable when accompanied by adequate snacks. As the celebration continued into the night, or what passed for night in a space station that rotated through 17 different time zones and existed partially outside conventional space-time, Cornelius found himself chatting with Grunthilda about the philosophical implications of cheese aging and whether the concept of fermentation could be applied to bureaucratic processes. You know, he said, watching a group of crystalline beings attempt to consume pizza through some process that involved harmonic resonance and looked remarkably like singing, I'm rather glad your friend Borthwick took so long with that protocol of his. Grunthilda quivered curiously, a process that made her look like an enthusiastic bowl of cosmic jello. Why is that? Well, Cornelius smiled. "If you'd contacted us 400 years ago, we probably would have tried to conquer you, convert you to our various religions, or at the very least, charged you taxes for visiting our solar system. By waiting, you gave us time to grow up a bit. And now? Now we're mature enough to realize that the universe is far too interesting to waste time on paperwork." And in the end, Earth's response to the most elaborate first contact protocol in galactic history had been perfect in its imperfection. By responding with silence, humanity had forced an entire galactic civilization to reconsider its approach to communication, bureaucracy, and the fundamental question of what really matters when two species meet for the first time. The answer, it turned out, was not forms or procedures or carefully crafted diplomatic protocols. It was not centuries of observation or thousands of pages of cultural analysis. It was not even the accumulated wisdom of galactic civilization or the combined experience of countless successful first contacts. It was simply this: "Hello, would you like to be friends?" And in a universe filled with complexity, sometimes the simplest response is the most profound one of all.